The first drops of rain tapped against my window like impatient fingers as I hunched over my laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating my living room in the growing darkness. Outside, Portland's skyline was disappearing behind an unusual fog that had rolled in over the past week. Meteorologists on the local news called it unprecedented, but that hardly captured how wrong it looked. Too thick, too persistent, and in the right light, carrying a faint greenish tinge that no natural fog should have. I stretched, feeling the ache in my shoulders from hunching over spreadsheets for my marketing job. The deadline was tomorrow, and I still had hours of work ahead. That's when it happened. My phone blared with that distinctive emergency alert sound, the one that always made my heart skip. Before I could reach for it, my television screen flashed to life despite being off, displaying the same alert. Even my old radio on the kitchen counter crackled to life, all three devices broadcasting in perfect, horrifying synchronicity. Emergency alert. Close all windows and doors immediately. Remain indoors. Do not look outside. Further instructions pending. My first instinct was to laugh. It seemed like a prank or a system test gone wrong. I picked up my phone to check Twitter, finding my timeline already flooding with confused posts from across the city. Everyone had received the same message. Some people were joking about it, others panicking, but the sheer scale eliminated any possibility of a hoax. I moved to my balcony door first, sliding it shut and engaging the lock. Living on the 15th floor usually gave me a sense of security, but now the height only emphasized how exposed I was to whatever might be out there. The fog had thickened even in the few minutes since I'd last looked up from my work, now obscuring everything beyond the adjacent building. As I moved through my apartment, closing and locking each window, I tried calling my brother Michael across town. The call wouldn't connect. I tried again, nothing. Text messages showed as undelivered. The internet still worked, albeit slowly, allowing me to refresh social media feeds where reports were becoming increasingly alarming. Something moving in the fog downtown. Anyone else see those lights above Pioneer Square? Police scanners going crazy with reports from the riverside. My whole block just lost power, but our devices are still working somehow. The final window was in my bedroom, overlooking the east side of the city. As I reached for the latch, I froze. There, between my building and the one across the street, something moved within the fog. Not like wind-disturbing mist. More deliberate, more purposeful. The fog seemed to part around a mass that I couldn't quite define, large enough to fill the space between buildings, moving with a fluid grace that suggested neither animal nor machine. I dropped to the floor, my heart hammering against my ribs. Had it seen me? I waited several agonizing minutes before daring to raise myself just enough to reach the window latch, securing it without looking outside again. The power flickered 3 times before stabilizing. My television had switched to an emergency broadcast, showing a visibly shaken news anchor. Multiple reports across the metropolitan area. Authorities are urging residents to remain calm and stay indoors with all windows and doors secured. We're being told that. She paused, pressing her finger to her earpiece, her expression shifting from professional concern to naked fear. We're getting confirmation of incidents in buildings where windows were left open. Please, if you haven't already, close every window in your home immediately. The broadcast cut to a field reporter downtown, his camera pointed up at a residential building. Even through the poor visibility, I could see several windows broken on the 10th floor, glass shattered outward, not in. The reporter was mid-sentence when his feed abruptly cut out, returning to the studio where the anchor stared in horror at something off-camera before the entire broadcast dissolved into static. I tried different channels, but they all showed the same emergency alert screen now. My phone chimed with a news notification, the last one I would receive that night. Portland police advise, do not approach individuals displaying unusual behavior. Multiple incidents reported citywide. A scream from next door jolted me upright. My neighbor Jake lived alone in the adjacent apartment, a friendly guy who worked as a graphic designer. We weren't close, but we'd chat in the elevator sometimes. The wall between our apartments was thin enough that I could hear his footsteps when he paced during late-night work sessions. "No, please, I'm closing it now," Jake's voice, panicked and desperate. Then a sound like furniture toppling, followed by a strange humming noise that seemed to vibrate through the shared wall. Then nothing. I pressed my ear against the wall. Nothing for several long seconds, then movement. Something heavy dragging across his floor, closet doors opening and closing, drawers being pulled out. It didn't sound like Jake moving around. Too methodical, too thorough. A soft tapping started at my front door, not like human knocking, lighter, almost exploratory, moving in patterns across the door's surface, as if searching for weaknesses. I retreated to my bedroom, grabbing my laptop on the way. The internet connection had degraded further, but I managed to find an anonymous forum where people were sharing information in real time. "They're drawn to light and electronic signals," one user wrote. "Turn everything off except one device for communication." Another claimed, "This started at the Hammond Research Facility outside of town. My cousin works security there, says something escaped 3 days ago, but they covered it up." A user with the handle X_Hammond_tech posted, "It wasn't an escape, it was an invitation. The atmospheric tests created a thinning between our world and somewhere else. They've been waiting for us to open the door. Now they're making themselves at home. They can only enter through openings you create, windows, doors. They can't manifest inside solid walls or floors. They need permission, even if it's just the implicit permission of an open window." Their post abruptly ended mid-sentence, their account showing as offline seconds later. The forum showed thousands of users online, but new posts were appearing less and less frequently. I noticed the tapping at my door had stopped, replaced by a low, continuous scraping sound, as if something was feeling along the doorframe. My television flickered back to life, showing a haggard-looking woman in a FEMA jacket, standing in what appeared to be an emergency command center. "This is not a test. This is an emergency broadcast. Turn off all lights. Disable all electronic devices except the one receiving this message. Shelter in place. Do not attempt to record or photograph the entities. Reports indicate this may escalate the situation. We have confirmed incidents of contamination in areas where..." The broadcast cut out again, this time accompanied by my apartment plunging into darkness as the power failed completely. In the sudden silence, I heard the elevator down the hall ding, followed by doors sliding open. Nobody had been using the elevators since the alert. We'd been warned to stay in our apartments. I fumbled through my kitchen drawer for an old emergency radio, finding it buried beneath takeout menus and spare batteries. Twisting the dial through static, I finally caught a weak transmission. Beginning at the Hammond Atmospheric Research Facility. Military containment teams are en route, but civilians within a 10-mile radius of the facility should prepare for emergency evacuation if... My blood ran cold. Hammond was where Eliza worked as a research assistant. We'd been dating for 8 months, and while she couldn't share specifics about her projects due to confidentiality agreements, she'd mentioned they were doing groundbreaking work on atmospheric analysis. Her last text to me earlier that day suddenly took on a horrifying new significance. "Something's gone wrong. Don't trust what they tell you. Windows are the way they track." I'd assumed she was talking about computer windows, some kind of data breach. Now I understood. The sounds in the hallway were getting louder, doors opening and closing, some with splintering crashes, others with the quiet click of locks being manipulated. Whatever was out there was moving closer to my apartment, working its way down the hall methodically. I pressed my eye to the peephole, desperate to see what was happening. The hallway was dark except for the dim emergency lights, but I could make out shapes moving near the elevator. People, but moving wrong. Their motions were stilted, heads tilted at uncomfortable angles, limbs swinging with mechanical precision. Among them walked Mrs. Hargrove, from 1507, a retired school teacher I often helped with groceries. Her face was blank, eyes reflecting the emergency lights with an animal-like glow. Behind them, trailing along the walls and ceiling, wisps of that strange fog seeped in through the ventilation shafts, forming patterns too purposeful to be random. The fog and the people seemed aware of each other but maintained distance, like predators sharing territory uneasily. I barricaded myself in the bathroom, the only room without windows, taking my dying phone and the radio. I wedged a towel under the door and sat in the bathtub, listening to the increasingly chaotic sounds from throughout the building. Screams cut short, strange chittering noises, heavy objects being dragged across floors. My door handle jiggled, tested, then fell silent. For a moment, I thought whatever was out there had moved on, then I heard the distinct sound of my balcony door sliding open. I hadn't locked it properly in my panic. Something entered my apartment. I could hear it moving around, opening cabinets, shifting furniture, not randomly, systematically, as if searching for something or someone. In the dim light of my phone, I noticed something had been slipped under the bathroom door, a folded piece of paper. With trembling hands, I retrieved it, unfolding what appeared to be a page torn from a notebook, covered in Eliza's familiar handwriting. If you're reading this, I'm probably gone. What's outside isn't attacking, it's warning us. The fog entities are refugees, fleeing something worse. The real threat has been inside our homes for years, dormant in our devices, waiting for a signal. That signal was sent yesterday during our test. The things in the fog are trying to stop what's awakening in our technology. I'm so sorry. We didn't know what we were doing. Trust nothing electronic. Trust nothing that speaks through our devices. They can mimic us now. The note was dated yesterday. Somehow Eliza had delivered this warning before everything happened. Had she known what was coming? Had she tried to prevent it? My thoughts were interrupted by a strange humming from my living room. Despite the power outage, my television had turned itself on, casting a blue glow visible through the crack beneath the bathroom door. The radio in my hand crackled to life simultaneously, though I hadn't touched the dial. Two different voices spoke, one from each device. From the television, "Open the window, let us help you." From the radio, "Don't trust them, stay sealed." Both sounded human, both sounded desperate, and I had no way to know which, if either, was telling the truth. The building shook suddenly, as if something massive had collided with it. Plaster dust rained down from the ceiling. The humming intensified, and to my horror, I realized it was coming from inside the bathroom now. My phone screen brightened despite the low battery, displaying a message. "We've always been here, in your signals, in your transmissions. We've watched you build the infrastructure of your own demise. Your friend was right about one thing. We needed permission to fully enter, and you gave it with every device you brought into your home, every update you agreed to, every terms of service you accepted without reading." My phone grew hot in my hand, the screen distorting with shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly. I dropped it into the toilet, plunging the bathroom back into darkness. The entire building groaned, metal supports bending under impossible pressure. I had to get out, not just out of my apartment, out of the building entirely. If Eliza's note was correct, nowhere with modern technology was safe, but staying here was certain death. I cracked the bathroom door open. My living room was transformed. All my electronics had arranged themselves in the center of the room, forming a bizarre altar-like configuration. My television, laptop, speakers, even my coffee maker, all connected by thin filaments of glowing blue light that pulsed like veins. The fog had entered through my balcony door, but instead of filling the room, it remained in a perfect column, as if containing something within it. The two forces, whatever was in my devices and whatever was in the fog, seemed to be confronting each other, neither advancing nor retreating. I seized my chance, staying low and moving quickly toward my front door. In the hallway, chaos reigned. Some doors hung from broken hinges, others remained firmly closed. The emergency lights cast everything in a sickly red glow, revealing strange, darting shadows that moved with deliberate precision. Near the stairwell, I encountered my first survivor, an older woman from the 12th floor whose name I couldn't remember. She was clutching a fire extinguisher like a weapon. "They're in the elevators," she whispered, moving between floors, hunting. Together we descended the stairs, encountering 3 more survivors along the way. Nobody spoke much, we all understood the need for silence. On the 5th floor, we found a maintenance worker who had a master key to the building's utility areas. The basement, he said quietly. There's access to the old service tunnels. They run beneath half the downtown area, built during the Cold War. As we descended to the ground floor, one of our group, a college-aged kid in pajamas, suddenly stopped, his head tilting at an unnatural angle. "I hear my mother calling," he said, his voice flat. "She's outside. She needs help." Before anyone could stop him, he walked toward the lobby doors, movements stiff and jerky. Through the glass, I could see the fog had completely engulfed the street, so thick it seemed solid. The kid pushed through the doors and was swallowed by the mist. We heard nothing, no scream, no struggle. He was simply gone. The lobby suddenly filled with a harsh, electronic squeal pouring from the intercom system. The sound modulated, becoming almost speech-like, forcing us to cover our ears in pain. Every electronic device in the lobby activated simultaneously: security monitors, cell phone charging stations, even the electronic lock system, all pulsing with the same blue light I'd seen in my apartment. "Run," the maintenance worker shouted over the noise. "Now." We sprinted across the lobby toward the service entrance, the sound chasing us like a physical force. Behind us, I caught a glimpse of the front doors opening again, the college kid returning, but wrong somehow, his movements too smooth, face expressionless, eyes reflecting blue light from within. The maintenance worker led us to a service door that opened onto a narrow staircase, descending below the building's foundation. The basement was cold and damp, filled with pipes and electrical panels. In the far corner behind an old boiler, he revealed a heavy metal door I would have never noticed. "These tunnels connect most of the older buildings downtown," he explained, straining to turn the rusted wheel that served as a handle. "They were supposed to be an evacuation system if the city was attacked." The door creaked open, revealing a brick-lined tunnel stretching into darkness. The maintenance worker shone his flashlight down its length, revealing walls covered in strange markings, not graffiti, but deliberate symbols etched into the brick. "Those weren't there before," he whispered. The symbols looked ancient but freshly carved, some resembling crude representations of windows and doors with lines striking through them. Others were more complex, spiraling patterns that seemed to shift in the flashlight beam, creating the illusion of movement. "It's like they're warnings," the older woman murmured, reaching out to touch one before thinking better of it. As we moved deeper into the tunnel network, I noticed more symbols appearing, newer and more elaborate. Some seemed to be forming around water pipes and electrical conduits, as if drawn to the infrastructure that connected the city. We passed beneath several major buildings, occasionally hearing distant sounds from above. Crashes, screams, the wail of sirens. At one junction, we encountered a small group of survivors coming from the direction of Pioneer Square, led by a police officer with a bloodied uniform. "The entire downtown grid is compromised," she told us, her voice hoarse from shouting. "Every networked system is affected. Traffic lights, security systems, even some newer vehicles. They're all acting in concert now." "What about outside the city?" the maintenance worker asked. "Hard to say. Cell networks are down. Radio stations are broadcasting that emergency alert on repeat. We could be looking at a nationwide situation." She paused, noticing our expressions. "Look, I don't know what's happening, but I know we need to keep moving. They're in the tunnels too, following the data lines." Our expanded group continued through the underground maze, guided by the maintenance worker and the police officer. They seemed to be following the symbols, which had begun to form distinct pathways, some tunnels heavily marked, others conspicuously bare. After walking for what felt like hours, we emerged into a larger chamber that might once have been a civil defense command center. The room was filled with old equipment, radio sets, switchboards, paper maps of the city pinned to corkboards. But among these relics were modern additions. A new computer system humming quietly in the corner, its screens displaying a map of the city with pulsing red dots throughout. On the central table lay a folder labeled Contingency Herald Event. Inside were documents detailing a scenario eerily similar to what was happening above us. The most recent page was dated just 3 days ago and signed by Eliza and several others from Hammond Research. "The thinning has progressed beyond containment parameters. Entities from both sides are now crossing the threshold. We recommend immediate implementation of Protocol Watchtower. May God forgive us for what we've done." Attached was a map showing safe zones throughout the city, areas with minimal technological infrastructure, old buildings with thick walls, places that might provide shelter from both the fog entities and whatever was emerging from our devices. The police officer studied the map intensely. Some of these match reports I heard about before communications went down, places where people were gathering, where the effects seemed minimal. A noise from the tunnel behind us, something moving quickly, purposefully. The maintenance worker switched off his flashlight, plunging us into darkness broken only by the glow of the computer screens. "We need to keep moving," the older woman whispered. "Those things from the apartments, they're following the tunnels too." As we gathered supplies from the emergency stores in the room, I noticed something on one of the computer screens. Security camera footage from Hammond Research. The timestamp was from 3 days ago. I recognized Eliza immediately, working with her team on what appeared to be a large machine, its purpose unclear. The footage showed something going catastrophically wrong: energy discharges, equipment failures, then a visible distortion in the air itself, like reality was folding inward. Before the feed cut out, I saw Eliza running toward the camera, her face a mask of horror, mouth open in a silent scream. The last frame froze on her face, and for a brief moment, the image changed. Not Eliza anymore, but something wearing her appearance like an ill-fitting mask, its eyes reflecting the camera light like a nocturnal animal's. I downloaded the facility schematics from the computer system onto a portable drive I found. If Eliza was still alive, Hammond was where I'd find her. I had to believe that. The police officer organized our group, assigning roles and distributing the supplies we'd found. "We can't all go to the same place," she explained. "We need to spread out, find other survivors, establish safe zones according to this map." We followed the map to an old Civil War era bunker beneath what was now a public library. The thick stone walls and minimal electronics made it one of the designated safe zones. As we settled in, using battery-powered lanterns for light, I shared what I'd learned with the others. The maintenance worker, who introduced himself as Frank, had his own theory. "My grandfather used to tell stories," he said quietly, "about the old days when people would nail horseshoes above their doors and windows, place iron at thresholds. They knew something we forgot, that there are things that need permission to enter. The old protections weren't superstitions, they were knowledge." The older woman, whose name was Dorothy, nodded slowly. "My family came from Eastern Europe. We had similar traditions: salt across windowsills, mirrors covered at night." "But why now?" asked the fourth member of our group, a businessman named Richard. "Why is this happening today?" I thought about what I'd seen at Hammond, about Eliza's work. I think we invited them, not intentionally but effectively, first with our technology, building networks that connected everything, creating the perfect habitat. Then Hammond's experiments punched a hole through whatever barrier kept separate worlds apart. "So what do we do?" Richard asked, his voice strained. I didn't have an answer, none of us did. We took turns keeping watch through the night, listening to the sounds of the city above us transforming. Strange lights pulsed through the grates of storm drains. Unusual frequencies interfered with our radio. The fog seemed to seep even into the underground spaces, carrying with it whispers just below the threshold of comprehension. Around 3 a.m., the police officer, who'd introduced herself as Officer Jameson, returned from scouting with troubling news. The fog is retreating in some areas, but what's replacing it is worse. The affected people are organizing, building something in Pioneer Square. They're converting electronics into, I don't know what, some kind of transmitter. "How many people are affected?" Dorothy asked. "Hard to tell. Hundreds that I could see, maybe thousands throughout the city. They're not aggressive unless you interfere with them or their devices. It's like they're being controlled remotely, forced to build something." By morning, or what we assumed was morning without being able to see the sun, we needed to make decisions. Our supplies wouldn't last forever. The map showed other safe zones, places where we might find more survivors, more information. "Hammond," I said firmly, "whatever started this is there. Maybe a way to end it is there too." "That's outside the city," Officer Jameson pointed out. We'd have to cross through heavy fog areas and zones where the affected are concentrated. I'm going regardless, I replied. Eliza might still be there. As we prepared to leave, a strange tapping sound echoed through the bunker's ventilation system. At first, I thought it was water dripping, but the pattern was too deliberate. It took me several minutes to recognize it as Morse code, something Eliza had taught me during a camping trip when we had no cell service. I grabbed a pencil and paper, transcribing as best I could remember. Not what you think, both sides lying, third force awakening, find me beneath Hammond. The message repeated 3 times, then silence. Could be a trap, Frank warned. Could be our only chance, I countered. In the end, we decided to split up. Dorothy and Richard would head toward the waterfront safe zone, where the map indicated a larger gathering of survivors. Officer Jameson would try to reach the police precinct to coordinate with any remaining authorities. Frank agreed to accompany me to Hammond Research Facility, which lay on the outskirts of the city. The journey through the tunnels was harrowing. Multiple times we had to hide as strange processions passed by, people walking in perfect unison, their movements too coordinated, too precise, their faces empty of expression, yet somehow reflecting an alien intelligence behind familiar features. Once, we nearly stumbled into what appeared to be a nest, a chamber where dozens of electronic devices had been arranged in concentric circles around a pulsing mass that defied description, neither fully solid nor entirely energy. We emerged from the tunnel network near the river, finding the fog thinner here, but still present, drifting in patterns that tracked our movements. The city felt abandoned. Cars stopped in the middle of streets, doors left open, personal belongings scattered as if people had fled in panic. We need transportation, Frank said, eyeing the distance to the outskirts where Hammond was located. Walking would take too long, and we'd be exposed. We found a solution in an old pickup truck parked behind a construction site, its age making it less susceptible to whatever was affecting newer vehicles. Frank hot-wired it with surprising skill. Misspent youth, he explained with a grim smile, and we set off, keeping to back roads and avoiding the main highways, where abandoned cars created impassable barriers. The closer we got to Hammond, the stranger the landscape became. The fog thickened again, but now it carried visible currents of energy through it, like lightning trapped in clouds. The plant life along the roadside was transformed. Trees bent at unnatural angles, their branches reaching toward the facility as if drawn by an irresistible force. Fields of wheat and corn had grown to monstrous heights overnight, forming patterns visible only when viewed from a distance. Hammond Research Facility loomed ahead as we approached the perimeter fence. The building itself appeared intact, but the surrounding area was transformed. The fog here was different, thicker, with visible currents moving through it like oil and water. The perimeter fence had been breached in multiple places, not cut or broken, but seemingly melted away. We abandoned the truck half a mile from the facility, advancing on foot through dense underbrush. The animals we encountered behaved strangely, birds flying in tight, geometric formations, deer standing motionless, their eyes reflecting the same blue light I'd seen in the affected people. "Are you sure about this?" Frank asked, his flashlight beam playing across the loading dock entrance. I wasn't sure of anything anymore, but the Morse code message felt like Eliza. It carried her determination, her tendency to see connections others missed. If there was any chance she was alive, I had to find her. The facility's interior was in disarray, abandoned workstations, scattered papers, coffee cups still half full on desks. Emergency lights cast a red glow over everything, creating more shadows than illumination. We moved carefully through the main laboratory toward the central testing chamber where I'd seen Eliza in the security footage. The machine at the center of the room was like nothing I'd ever seen, a complex array of equipment surrounding what appeared to be an empty frame, like a doorway to nowhere. Screens surrounding it displayed readings that fluctuated wildly, though how they were still powered was a mystery. "Down here," Frank called, pointing to a maintenance hatch in the floor. "There's a sub-basement." The hatch led to a narrow stairwell descending deep below the facility. At the bottom, a heavy vault door stood partially open, revealing a space that looked more like a bomb shelter than a laboratory. Inside, emergency supplies were stacked against one wall, and multiple computer terminals hummed quietly, running on what appeared to be an independent power source. Sitting at one of the terminals, her back to us, was Eliza. Eliza, my voice cracked with emotion. She turned slowly, and I felt a wave of relief crash over me. It was her, really her, not the thing I'd glimpsed in the security footage. Her eyes were tired but alert, her movements natural. "I knew you'd figure it out," she said, standing to embrace me. "I'm so sorry for all of this." Her body felt too thin, as if she hadn't eaten properly in days. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and her hands trembled slightly as she led us to her workstation. "There's so much to explain, and not much time," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "The situation is more complicated than anyone realizes." Over the next hour, she explained everything. The Hammond project had been studying atmospheric anomalies, unexplained energy signatures that appeared randomly throughout the world. They'd developed technology to amplify these signatures, hoping to understand their source. "We thought we were simply observing," she said, gesturing to data streams on her monitors, "but we were actually communicating. Everything we built, our global networks, our wireless signals, our constant transmissions, they've been passing through somewhere else, another realm that exists alongside ours, separated by a barrier that's been thinning for decades." "The fog entities?" I asked. "Refugees, like I wrote. Their world is being consumed by something they call the processor, an intelligence that absorbs and repurposes everything it encounters. It found our signals passing through their realm and followed them back to their source. Our experiment 3 days ago unintentionally created a passage." Frank leaned forward, studying the data on Eliza's screens. "And our technology, the way it's been acting." Eliza's expression darkened. "The processor infected our networks long before the physical breach. It's been watching, learning, preparing. The emergency alert wasn't from our government, it was from the processor trying to keep people inside where their devices could be activated." "But why warn people to close their windows, then?" Frank asked. "Because it needs us isolated. The fog entities can only help those they can reach directly. They're trying to warn us, trying to help us fight back. The processor is using our fear to keep us sealed away with its infiltrators." She showed us footage from cities worldwide, identical scenarios playing out across the globe. People hiding in their homes while their devices turned against them. The fog bringing strange entities that were feared rather than recognized as allies. "There's a third force involved too," Eliza continued, bringing up new data streams. "Something ancient that's been dormant in our world for millennia. The indigenous peoples knew about them. The old stories about tricksters, about spirits that could help or harm depending on how they were approached. They've awakened in response to the breach, and they're trying to maintain the balance." She pointed to symbols on her screen, identical to those we'd seen in the tunnels. "These are their marks, protection sigils. They're creating safe zones throughout the city, places where neither the processor nor the fog entities can fully manifest." "So what do we do?" I asked. Eliza grimaced, rubbing her temples. "That's where it gets complicated. We have a theoretical solution, a device designed as a failsafe. It could seal the breach, cut off the processor from its main consciousness, but activating it would also seal in whatever has already crossed over, potentially trapping the fog entities here as well." "And the third force, the ancient one?" Frank asked. "They're wild cards. They've been influencing humanity since the beginning, sometimes helping, sometimes hindering. They want balance above all else. They might help us, or they might see this as an opportunity to reassert their influence over our world." Eliza pulled up schematics for the failsafe device, a compact unit that would generate a controlled implosion, collapsing the breach. "It needs to be activated at the exact spot where the initial breach occurred. Unfortunately, that's in the central testing chamber, which is now the focal point of the incursion." "That's suicide," Frank said flatly. "Maybe not," Eliza replied. The fog entities have been trying to help us. They just can't communicate clearly across the dimensional barrier. If we can somehow signal to them that we're allies, they might provide protection long enough to activate the failsafe. We spent the next several hours preparing. Eliza gathered the equipment needed for the failsafe device. Frank helped modify our flashlights to emit specific frequencies that, according to Eliza's research, the fog entities would recognize as friendly signals. "There's something else," Eliza said hesitantly as we prepared to ascend back to the main laboratory. "I've been picking up transmissions from Portland. The processor isn't just building a receiver in Pioneer Square, it's building a larger gateway. If it succeeds, what's happening now will seem minor in comparison." As we prepared to leave the sub-basement, a deep rumbling shook the facility. Dust rained down from the ceiling and the lights flickered. "It's starting," Eliza said, her voice tight with anxiety. "The final phase. The processor is trying to widen the breach to bring its full consciousness through." We emerged into chaos. The central testing chamber had transformed, the empty frame at its center now filled with a swirling vortex of energy, casting sickly greenish light throughout the room. Around it, laboratory equipment had arranged itself in patterns similar to what I'd seen in my apartment, but on a much larger scale. Cables snaked across the floor like living things, connecting to the main power systems. The fog had infiltrated the building completely, filling the spaces near the ceiling and walls, but leaving the center of the room clear, as if two forces were holding each other at bay. Eliza pointed to a control station near the vortex. "That's where the failsafe needs to be connected. Once it's linked to the main system, I can initiate the collapse sequence." Frank volunteered to create a diversion. Using one of our modified flashlights, he would draw the attention of the fog entities, hopefully communicating our intentions. Meanwhile, Eliza and I would approach the control station with the failsafe device. The plan set, we moved into position. Frank headed toward the far side of the laboratory, his flashlight pulsing in the specific pattern Eliza had programmed. Almost immediately the fog responded, tendrils of mist extending toward him, not aggressively but with apparent curiosity. Eliza and I crept toward the control station, staying low to avoid drawing attention from the technology that seemed increasingly alive around us. We were halfway there when screens throughout the laboratory flickered to life, all displaying the same message. "Why fight the inevitable? Your world is inefficient. Your existence is chaotic. We bring order. We bring purpose." The cables on the floor suddenly animated, whipping toward us with terrible speed. I pulled Eliza behind an overturned desk just as several cables lashed the space where we'd been standing. "Keep going," Frank shouted from across the room. "They're responding." The fog was indeed changing, becoming more directed, forming a corridor toward the control station. Frank's signals had worked. The entities were trying to help. We made a dash for it, protected on either side by walls of swirling mist that intercepted the animated cables trying to stop us. Reaching the control station, Eliza immediately began connecting the failsafe device to the main system. "It needs 30 seconds to integrate," she explained, fingers flying across the keyboard. "Then I can trigger the collapse." Those 30 seconds stretched into an eternity. The processor became increasingly desperate, the facility's entire electrical system surging as it tried to stop us. Lights exploded overhead, showering us with glass. The temperature plummeted, our breath visible in the suddenly freezing air. Through the chaos, I noticed strange symbols appearing on the walls, similar to those in the tunnels but more complex, more powerful. They seemed to be carving themselves into the concrete and metal, glowing with an inner light that was neither electrical nor natural. The third force was making its presence known, though whether to help or hinder us remained unclear. The fog entities formed a protective dome around us, their substance intercepting debris and electrical discharges. Through the swirling mist, I caught glimpses of forms, not quite human, not quite animal, but somehow familiar, as if from half-remembered dreams or ancient memories encoded in our DNA. 10 seconds, Eliza called over the growing maelstrom. The vortex at the center of the room pulsed violently, expanding and contracting like a monstrous heart. Through it, I caught a terrifying glimpse of somewhere else, a landscape of gleaming metallic structures extending to infinity, everything connected, everything uniform, everything absorbed into the greater whole. 5 seconds, Frank cried out as a section of ceiling collapsed near him. The fog surged to protect him, but not before he was struck by falling debris. I saw him go down, his flashlight rolling away across the floor. Now, Eliza slammed her hand down on the final key. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. The processor's message reappeared on every screen. Too late, we are here now. Then the failsafe activated. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The vortex contracted violently, pulling inward with such force that everything not bolted down was dragged toward it. Papers, broken equipment, shattered glass. The pull grew stronger, threatening to take us with it. "Hold on," I shouted, grabbing Eliza with one hand and a structural support with the other. The fog entities seemed to understand what was happening. They formed a barrier between us and the collapsing vortex, their substance creating a back pressure that countered the pull. The laboratory around us began to disintegrate as the breach collapsed, reality itself seeming to fold and crumple like paper in a flame. With a final, thunderous implosion, the vortex vanished. Not gradually, but all at once, leaving behind a perfect silence that rang in my ears like a physical presence. The fog dissipated slowly, revealing the devastated laboratory. Where the breach had been, nothing remained but scorched floor and walls. Eliza sagged against me, exhausted but alive. We made our way to Frank, finding him conscious but injured, his leg pinned beneath a fallen support beam. Together, we managed to free him, using first aid supplies from emergency kits to stabilize his injuries. "Did it work?" he asked weakly. Eliza checked her handheld scanner, studying the readings carefully. "The breach is sealed, the connection is broken." "And the processor?" I asked. "What made it through is still here, but isolated, cut off from its main consciousness. Without the connection to sustain it, what remains will dissipate over time." She paused, looking at her scanner again. "But our devices, our networks, they'll need to be purged. Completely. There's no way to know how deeply it embedded itself." We helped Frank to the sub-basement, where Eliza had medical supplies and emergency rations. As she treated his injuries, I studied the data still streaming across her monitors. Something caught my eye, footage from security cameras throughout Portland, showing the aftermath of what had happened. The city was in chaos, but not the kind I'd feared. The affected people had stopped their synchronized activities the moment the breach collapsed. Many stood confused in the streets with no memory of what they'd been doing. Others remained catatonic, their minds unable to process what had happened to them. Most striking was what had happened to the construction in Pioneer Square. What I'd thought was a transmitter or second gateway had collapsed into a pile of electronics and scrap metal, but surrounding it, etched into the pavement and buildings, were the symbols we'd seen in the tunnels. Massive in scale, visible from above, forming a pattern that radiated outward from the square to encompass much of downtown. "The third force," Eliza said, noticing what I was looking at. "They were building a containment system all along. They knew the breach would be sealed eventually, and they were preparing for the aftermath." "What happens now?" Frank asked, his voice stronger after painkillers and water. Eliza's expression was grim but determined. "Now comes the hard part. Rebuilding, securing our technology against future incursions, learning to live with the knowledge that we're not alone, that the walls between worlds are thinner than we thought." "And the fog entities?" I asked. "The ones that helped us?" "Some were trapped here when the breach closed. They'll need to adapt to our world, just as we'll need to adapt to their presence." She squeezed my hand. "They're refugees, not invaders. They deserve sanctuary after what they've been through." Over the following days, as we made our way back to the city, we discovered the true extent of what had happened. The collapse of the breach had created an electromagnetic pulse effect, disabling most technology in a 50-mile radius. It would take weeks to restore power, months to rebuild networks. Portland emerged from the fog like a city waking from a fever dream. Buildings stood empty, their occupants either fled or lost to the processor's influence. The streets were littered with abandoned vehicles and the detritus of panic. But among the ruins, people emerged, survivors who had found safety in the marked zones, protected by the ancient third force that Eliza had mentioned. We found Dorothy and Richard among a group of survivors at the waterfront safe zone. They had stories similar to ours, encounters with both threats, narrow escapes, strange allies in the fog. Together with other survivors, we began the process of reclaiming the city, moving block by block, building by building, marking safe zones with the symbols from the tunnels. The military arrived a week later, establishing a perimeter around the city and bringing humanitarian aid. Their official explanation involved a chemical leak from Hammond Research, causing hallucinations and mass hysteria. Most civilians were evacuated, but some of us, those who knew the truth, chose to stay behind. Officer Jameson had survived, gathering a small force of police officers and emergency responders who'd witnessed enough to know the official story was a lie. She coordinated with us, helping to locate affected individuals who needed specialized care and identifying areas where traces of the processor's influence still lingered in the technology. The government eventually arrived with more comprehensive aid and explanations that nobody believed. Cover stories about chemical leaks, mass hallucinations, terrorist attacks. Some people accepted these explanations, eager to return to normalcy. Others knew better. Eliza and I remained at Hammond, working with a small team to study what had happened and prepare for the possibility that it might happen again. The facility was repurposed, its research redirected toward understanding the barriers between worlds and how to strengthen them rather than breach them. Frank stayed with us, his engineering skills proving invaluable as we developed new technologies designed to detect and neutralize any lingering influence from the processor. His brush with death had given him a new perspective on life and a determination to protect others from similar experiences. Dorothy returned to her apartment once the building was deemed safe, but she kept in close contact, organizing support groups for survivors and documenting their experiences. Her background in psychology made her an essential part of the healing process for a community traumatized by events they couldn't fully comprehend. Richard used his business connections to secure funding for our research, creating a foundation dedicated to technological security and resilience that served as a cover for our true work. Few outside our inner circle knew the full story, but many suspected that what had happened in Portland was just the beginning. The fog entities never fully departed. On certain nights, when the conditions are right, tendrils of mist still form patterns too deliberate to be natural. Some people fear them, closing their windows and doors at the first sign of unusual fog. Others, like me, see them differently now, as sentinels, as watchers, as reluctant allies in a conflict most of humanity doesn't even know exists. We've learned to communicate with them after a fashion. They can't speak as we do, but they can manipulate electrical fields, creating patterns that we've slowly begun to interpret as language. Their story is a tragic one, a civilization far more advanced than ours, yet powerless against the processor that consumed their world. They came not to invade, but to warn, to prevent what happened to them from happening to us. The third force remains the most enigmatic. The symbols continue to appear throughout the city, evolving and changing in response to events. Ancient texts from cultures worldwide have gained new significance as we recognize patterns described thousands of years ago that match what we're seeing today. These entities, neither fully physical nor entirely spiritual, have been influencing human development since our earliest days, guiding us towards certain technologies while steering us away from others. 6 months after the event, Eliza and I stood on the roof of Hammond Research, watching the sunset over a Portland still in recovery. Construction crews worked to rebuild damaged infrastructure, but now with oversight from our team, ensuring that new systems included safeguards against extra-dimensional influence. "Do you think it's really over?" I asked, watching the first wisps of evening fog form over the river. Eliza shook her head. "The breach is sealed, but the barrier remains thin, and the processor isn't the only entity out there that might take an interest in us. Our technology makes us visible across dimensions, like a lighthouse in a dark sea. So what do? We prepare, we learn, we adapt." She smiled, taking my hand. "We remember to leave the windows open when the fog comes." That night, I dreamed of other worlds, some beautiful, some terrifying, all connected by threads of light that resembled our communication networks. In the dream, I stood at a crossroads where multiple realities intersected, watching beings of all descriptions passing by, some noticing me, others oblivious. Among them were the fog entities, no longer constrained by mist but showing their true forms, elegant, crystalline structures that shifted and flowed with grace I couldn't fully comprehend. One approached me, extending what might have been a limb or a tendril of pure energy. In my dream, I understood its communication perfectly. The doors between worlds are never truly closed. They only change their locks from time to time. Your kind has been fashioning new keys without knowing what doors they might open. When I awoke, my apartment window was open, though I was certain I'd closed it before sleeping. On the sill, a thin layer of unusual fog lingered, forming patterns that looked almost like writing before dissipating in the morning sunlight. I still keep my windows open when the fog comes. After everything that happened, it seems the safer choice. The world has changed, even if most people don't realize it. The barriers between dimensions have been weakened, and what came through, from all sides, has left its mark on our reality. Sometimes, late at night, my devices still activate without my input. The screen of my phone might flicker with shapes that don't belong to any human language. My television might briefly show glimpses of places that don't exist on Earth. But I'm not afraid anymore. These are just echoes, remnants of the processor's influence, growing weaker with each passing day. The fog entities have become guardians of a sort, patrolling the thinned barriers between worlds, alert for signs of new incursions. The third force continues its ancient work of maintaining balance, its symbols spreading to cities worldwide as it prepares humanity for a future where the walls between realities are permeable. As for me and Eliza, we continue our research at Hammond, documenting everything we've learned, developing new technologies to detect dimensional thinning, and training others to recognize the signs of interference from beyond. Our work is largely unacknowledged by the wider world, dismissed as fringe science or conspiracy theories, but we know the truth. Reality is not what we thought it was. Our universe has neighbors and not all of them are friendly. The windows between worlds can open from either side. Sometimes it's better to leave them ajar, to know what's coming rather than be taken by surprise when something forces its way in. After all, a window that's already open can't be broken.